se llama Karlstom. Ella es de la Universidad de Uppsala, Suecia. Ella es una persona con una larga trayectoria, su formación básica es en arqueología, pero tiene una larga formación en lo que se refiere a estudios críticos del patrimonio, que por eso nos pareció muy interesante que esté aquí, porque ella se dedica, trabajó en Tailandia, en Suecia y Tailandia son sus bases principales. Ella se dedica al análisis del patrimonio como un fenómeno social, cultural, político, estrechamente vinculado al poder y justamente a desmontar y entender esas estructuras. Ha trabajado en patrimonio tanto material como inmaterial y tiene un interés en estudios postcoloniales y además es profesora y es una excelente profesora, muy comprometida con decolonizar algunas estructuras europeas donde ella... Entonces, hello Ana, good morning, I am introducing you. Así que es un placer tenerla acá. Sepan que cualquier consulta que le quieran hacer, después se le proporciona su mail. Y vamos a escuchar brevemente a la profesora Ana Karlstom de Uppsala. Hello Ana, we are ready to listen to you. Good morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Leticia. Thank you, organizers of this colloquium focusing on museums, culture and society. And especially then to you, Leticia, who invited me today to say something about our contemporary heritage discourse and how it relates to museum research and practices. And I also would like to start to express my apologies for not speaking Spanish. I'm so sorry for that. So let me see now. I start. Can you see the shared PowerPoint now?
Thank you very much for giving, thank you very much, Anna, for sharing this time with us. Thank you very much.
I'm honored. So, I have been asked to contextualize museums in the emerging field of critical heritage studies. So I will start by briefly account for contemporary heritage discourse, and then I will move on to speak more specifically about the post-colonial situation and the emergence of critical heritage studies. I will then illustrate with some examples and then finish by looking a little bit ahead. And I will speak for about 30 minutes, and then I hope that we have time for questions and answers, maybe.
Yes,
and I also want to make a notice that I will try to speak as clearly as possible. I mean, English is not my native language either, so I speak in the way I do, and I hope that you will be able to follow. And if you cannot, you just, I don't know, you raise your hand or ask the organizers to translate something. So you are welcome to interrupt if you want that.
One second, Ana, sorry. Dice Ana que cualquier duda que tengan, ustedes nos preguntan, levantan la mano y se traduce. Es un ejercicio, yo sé, y después si no, también tenemos todo el tiempo para traducir todos los conceptos que se requiera traducir. No tengan vergüenza porque la idea es trabajar juntos. I was telling them not to be ashamed. We will ask you as much as they need. Please continue.
Perfect.
Sorry, I interrupted.
Yes. Okay, so talking about heritage first. Heritage is objects, places, and traditions that are or may be inherited from one generation to another. So that is both tangible and intangible, and both cultural and natural. And almost 400 years ago, the first law concerning the protection of heritage was formulated. And since then, most countries in the world have now laws for protection and preservation of its heritage. And already from the beginning, that which was identified as heritage was closely connected to specific nation states. So the protection of it often went hand in hand with the establishment and proclamation of certain national identities, and was used to show and emphasize the state's glorious past. And in that sense, heritage has always been political. However, this political aspect of heritage was not so obvious and outspoken until the 20th century. As long as the approach to cultural heritage was solely material-based, which means focus was on monuments and objects, etc., the relation between heritage and politics was not particularly strong. Well, of course, heritage was used to indicate power through, for example, raising monuments, as you might know, but it was not so much debated as it is today. So with the post-colonial condition in which we are today and have been primarily since the mid-20th century, and which is a consequence of imperialism and colonialism and subsequent reactions towards colonialism and power imbalances, heritage has become more outspokenly political. And having said this, I from now on talk about the kind of officially supported and formally regulated heritage that we see today and that preceded the post-colonial condition as the authorized heritage discourse. And this concept was coined by Laura Jane Smith in 2006 in her book Uses of Heritage, and is quite common now to use in heritage discourse. But here I want to make a proviso, because there have been, of course, heritage management and practice all over the world in all times. And this is part of the problem and challenge. But as an academic discipline, heritage studies was established in the West and thereby closely connected to colonialism during the 20th century. So much of the heritage management and practice have dealt with protection of sites and monuments, and in museums then, of course, objects and artifacts. And still today, this is what much of heritage management and practice is all about. So we have moved from defining heritage as a thing with an inherent value to considering heritage as a process, something that we create today with help of objects and traditions from the past. And we have moved from conservation and preservation of objects and monuments, where we want these to be in their original state, to instead, to some degree, accept decay and manage change. So heritage studies does not only include the practice of management and preservation, but it also is a theoretical inquiry today. And critical heritage studies then started to develop around 15-20 years ago as a consequence of the move from seeing heritage as object with inherent value to seeing heritage as process, to which we ascribe certain values in the making, and as a reaction to power imbalances and Western domination in the heritage field. So the Association of Critical Heritage Studies was then formed 10 years ago. And here I want to make my second proviso. Even though Eurocentrism and Western dominance is heavily critiqued in the Association of Critical Heritage Studies, the majority of scholars supporting and constituting critical heritage studies are scholars educated in the West, including me. So, when the association was formulated or established in 2012, a manifesto was also formulated. And in this manifesto, the association calls upon heritage scholars to question the conservative cultural and economic power relations, which outdated understandings of heritage seem to underpin, and instead invite the active participation of people and communities who to date have been marginalized in the creation and management of heritage. And above all, Association of Critical Heritage Studies wants scholars to critically engage with the proposition that heritage studies needs to be rebuilt from bottom up. Heritage is, as much as anything, a political act, and we need to ask serious questions about the power relations that heritage has all too often been invoked to sustain. Nationalism, imperialism, colonialism, cultural elitism, social exclusion based on class and ethnicity, and the fetishizing of expert knowledge have all exerted strong influences on how heritage is used, defined, and managed. And we argue that a truly critical heritage studies will ask many uncomfortable questions of traditional ways of thinking about and doing heritage, and that the interests of the marginalized and excluded minorities will be brought to the forefront when posing these questions. The study of heritage has historically been dominated by Western, predominantly European experts in archaeology, history, museology, architecture, art history, and so on. Though there have been progressive currents in these disciplines, they sustain a limited idea of what heritage is and how it should be studied and managed. The old way of looking at heritage privileges old, grand, prestigious, expert-approved sites, buildings, and artifacts that sustain Western narratives of nation, class, and science. So, with this manifesto, the association then means that, and you see the list there of what it requires, an opening up to a wider range of intellectual traditions, and exploration of new methods and inquiry. It requires the creation of new international and multidisciplinary heritage networks and increasing dialogue and debate. And it requires taking seriously diverse non-Western cultural heritage traditions. And democratizing heritage by consciously rejecting elite cultural narratives, which goes hand in hand with the former one. And finally, it requires the integration of heritage and museum studies with studies of memory, public history, community, tourism, planning and development. So to summarize critical heritage studies then, before checking in with some examples, it is a consequence of the post-colonial condition and a result of reactions towards inequalities and injustices regarding class, gender, and ethnicity. And it is focusing on justice, rights, bottom-up approaches, identity issues, political aspects, etc. And it also, I must say, conclude this with that it concurs with the awakened interest of intangible cultural heritage. However, this is to a large extent still within the authorized heritage discourse. And here, because I wanted to say something about the context we are in now when we're in Uruguay, or you, since I'm in Sweden. But actually this interest of intangible cultural heritage, the official interest of intangible cultural heritage started in your part of the world. And here I want to just mention that, that after years of conducting fieldwork within UNESCO, the Icelandic folklorist Valdimar Hafstein has traced the history of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, which was formulated in 2003, to the Andes in South America. And its controversies around a specific piece of music, which came to be famous in the West as Simon and Garfunkel's song El Condor Pasa. And I will not account for the entire story here, but Valdimar has created a wonderful documentary film about his fieldwork in UNESCO. So if you check this site, you find a 30-minute long film where he accounts for this story. But in brief, I just want to mention that a letter to UNESCO from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Bolivia in 1973 is formally, officially considered to be the starting point for the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention and the work to create that. And this letter from 73 proclaims that forms of heritage, such as music and dance, which is not then the material, the tangible, that these forms of heritage is not protected enough by any international conventions. And he urges for that. And it also argues for this urgent action to do something about this problem. And furthermore, commercialism, tourism, exploitation, etc., are put forward as the main threats to this kind of heritage. However, Valdemar Hafstein in his research traces this controversy far back in time, even longer, hundreds of years, and argues in the end of his research that neither intangible cultural heritage nor the protection or the fight over intangible cultural heritage is something new that UNESCO introduced by their Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. What he argues is that it just became institutionalized by that, and hence part of the authorized heritage discourse. So now I want to bring up some examples from my own Southeast Asian perspective. So I try to move from outside of Europe and the Western world. And this example, they concern alternative collection management, because I wanted it to connect to your field of interest also, which is museums. So I would like to start with a very short film, just a few seconds actually. Let me see now. Here we have it. Okay, you ready? Okay, this was one of the oldest temples in Vientiane in Laos, which Vientiane is the capital in Laos, in Southeast Asia. And this temple had a very well preserved interior murals depicting a creation story, or the Lao version of the Ramayana. The temple, which you saw, was demolished 20 years ago, and I happened to be there when I did a feasibility study for what later became my PhD project. I spoke to the people you saw in the film, and these people, they had been planning the demolition of the temple for several years. And I understood soon that this was part of the preservation of a cultural heritage rather than a destructive demolition, which was what the heritage managers and I saw when we came there, of course. So in a context like this, where Buddhism, animism, Hinduism interact, the material heritage values are often subordinated to immaterial spiritual values, and preservation subordinate to impermanence. The most meritorious thing you can do is to contribute to the construction of a new temple, and for the new temple to start to work. The old one, the physical shell of the old one, must be demolished so that the spiritual values that are central to the religious practice and core of cultural heritage can be freed and go into the new shell, the new temple. So by being part of this and trying to understand it, my taken for granted preservation ideology, very much grounded in the authorized heritage discourse, was fundamentally shaken and replaced by a questioning of the same, which has then after that become my kind of contribution, I hope, to heritage research. So this big question of preservation or not preservation, and of materiality versus immateriality, forms both the background to and the framework for this presentation today. I'm sure you are aware of new museology and concepts such as decolonizing the museum, etc. And these are concepts that I am, with inspiration from them, the purpose of what I talk about now is to broadening the view of collection management. There are museum objects that, for various reasons, are not allowed or willing to take any place in either museums or conventional collections. So through studying how museum objects outside the museum's borders are managed, I want to suggest a kind of third space, which is a concept in post-colonial theory that you are maybe familiar with. A third space where conventional collection management interacts and is conducted in parallel with what may seem to be the opposite, namely destruction, change, and use, and where concepts like authenticity, originality, and age, they need to be nuanced. And I suggest that this third space is what is needed to highlight and quite central to critical heritage studies, a third space of heritage management that is characterized above all by approaches to change and to the relationship between materiality and immateriality, which then challenge contemporary Western cultural heritage discourse. I will continue with sharing this again. So, Southeast Asia is famous for its bronzes. In several museums that you see in the pictures here, often the world's foremost museums, there are objects and artifacts from the Bronze Age that we can look at in displays and read about in exhibition catalogs. One of the most spectacular categories of finds are the so-called dongson drums with their intricate patterns, and which testified to early and very advanced technology, already dating back to 3,000 years ago. The first drums that attracted attention in the West were excavated during the colonial period in what was then Indochina by French archaeologists in the village of Dongsin. Since then, they have been excavated throughout Southeast Asia, collected in museums, and unfortunately also ended up in private collections, often as a result of looting and illegal trade. And this is the European perspective. But from a Southeast Asian perspective, the bronze drums have been ever present and not at all discovered by French archaeologists. And especially not only in Dongsun, which just happened to be a dot on the map where the archaeological excavation was carried out. They have been manufactured, used, managed on an ongoing basis. Within several of the ethnic minorities who mainly live in the areas between Southeast Asia's national borders today, in the borderlands between the countries, they have been part of a continuous cultural heritage practice. If the drums are old enough and authentic, there is a high probability that they will end up in a museum. However, as you see here in the photo, this is from the province museum in Tanhua, where Dongsun is. So it's very famous for this site. So they take advantage of that and display the very nice examples of bronze drums. The vast majority of the drums are far beyond the borders of museums, though, but nevertheless an extremely valuable cultural heritage. So we know how they are collected and managed in a museum context, but we know very little about how collection management works outside the boundaries of museums, and that is what I have been doing research on. In Burma, Myanmar, as you might know, there is a conflict going on now since more than a year ago. But what you may not know is that there has been a civil war in the country already since the 1940s, especially between different ethnic minorities and the ruling military regime. Kaya is the country's smallest province, and a large part of its population fled the war, especially in the 70s to the 90s, and ended up in refugee camps in Thailand, where most are still today, or they are internally displaced either on the run without a home or forcibly moved to new settlements controlled by the Burmese state. Kaya and Kaya are some of the groups whose culture is tightly interwoven with the use of bronze drums from prehistoric times until today, continuously. The drums are significant in origin stories, and they also appear on the Kaya flag. In connection with the escape wave, or where they had to flee the war, the drums were dug down, hidden, or left wind by wave. And we can see that the international illegal trade in antiquities from this area increased markedly during that period, which also coincided with the Cold War. Kun Darön, a person I have worked with during my fieldwork, he is what is called Pa Kha in Thai. And that means someone who is into small-scale business, small-scale trade. And he actively participated during several of my fieldwork periods in this area. And he told me about his parents who also engaged in similar activities in the 1970s. And he took me to people his parents and himself both bought bronze drums from and sold to. So with the help of Kun Darön, I was able to identify a network of people involved in a kind of temporary management of cultural heritage objects. Several current owners of bronze drums consider themselves to cherish cultural heritage and contribute to the maintenance and preservation of the traditions that, in this case, the Kaya and Kaya groups in the camps cannot sustain themselves as long as they are refugees. In several cases, drums have been returned to those who managed to get out of the camps and return to their villages. And in other cases, they are managed and given new meanings by their temporary hosts. So, for example, here you can see in the picture a bronze drum in a house in an ordinary family living in Mae Hong Son who bought this bronze drum from Kun Darön's parents in the 1970s, and they still keep it. Both they cherish it as a piece of cultural heritage, but they also consider themselves as temporary stewards of this object until the owners can return and get it back. But now we move to Guangxi province in southern China, where the population mostly consists of various ethnic minorities. And those with the strongest connection to the bronze drums are either Chuang or Bai Kuyao. Bai Kuyao is the smaller group with a population of only 40,000 people. The bronze drums form a central part of people's lives. In many cases, the drum is the most valuable thing the family has in their house. The drum is treated like a family member, has a soul, a name, and a story of its own. And on several occasions during the year, the drum is used in various ceremonies, then with the utmost care and according to strict rules. Some of the 93 drums used at the funeral here that you can see are almost 3,000 years old, but others are almost completely new. A good distance from the village, but still in Guangxi province, is a factory where Wei Chi-hu controls the production of new bronze drums, as you can see to the right in the picture. He has been given official status as an inheritor of living intangible cultural heritage in China, and says they sell between 5 and 10 new bronze drums each year to people who are either Bai Kuyao or Chuang, and who buy the drums for use in traditional heritage practice. He himself is neither Chuang nor Bai Kuyao, but nevertheless, he organizes an installation ceremony in the factory for every single drum that he sells. In the factory, souvenirs are also made in the form of mini drums that are sold to tourists, and sometimes orders come from state level. And of course, they don't need an installation ceremony. But what gives the drum its value is how fine it sounds, and that depends on the composition of the metals and the manufacturing process, but also how strong a soul it has and the degree to which it allows itself to be charged with spiritual power before the ceremonies. Oops, sorry. Sorry. I have to. Just a moment. Okay. The age of the drum is completely irrelevant, and if it is not loaded, it can be used by anyone and even be part of a music and dance show as a tourist attraction at the local museum, which you also see here in the picture. And then we move finally back to Laos, on the border between Laos and Vietnam in Pin district, where just over 15 years ago a bronze drum was found buried in the ground. The area is home to not only the ethnic minority Khmu, who have a historical connection as users of the drums, but also to other minorities and people belonging to the majority Lao population. Due to conflicts in the area and the proximity to the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the vulnerability during the Cold War, the Khmu population has stopped using the drums. They were buried or hidden by the older generation that now no longer exists and took the tradition with them in the grave. However, the memory of the bronze drum use remains, but is not strong enough for it to be transformed into practice. The drum that was found, which you can see in the picture, in Pa Saksit, which is a kind of a secret forest, has come to symbolize the history of the place and is considered too charged and too dangerous to be completely excavated at all. Bun Kam, Mr. Bun Kam, a man who lives in one of the villages around the forest, is the head of the local office of the Ministry of Culture. And according to the National Heritage Law, such finds like this belong to the state and must be handed over to the National Museum in Vientiane. And this is especially important given that Laos is now struggling last in line in the Southeast Asian context to establish a rich history on which the country can build its national identity. And in this case, Mr. Bun Kam believes that his role as a resident of the village and part of the merit-making practice performed around the drum is much stronger and more important than the role of the Ministry of Culture's man out in the province. And one of his neighbors, with Mr. Bun Kam's good memory, has even broken off a piece from the bronze drum and made an amulet that he wears around his neck as a lucky charm. And at the same time, in Vientiane, in the National Museum, no bronze drums from Pin are documented or even recorded or known about. So, to summarize on time, I hope, I believe that future collection management can only be sustainable if it is truly inclusive. And in order for us as museum staff and researchers to reach that sustainable, inclusive kind of future collection management, we must learn to understand these complexities and be able to interpret them and to accept change and even some decay, and also to relate better to living cultural heritage practices. Now my examples were about Asia, but this is applicable globally. So we must dare to be in this third space, in between and in the border areas, wherever they are. So instead of consolidating and confirming existing dichotomies between tangible and intangible, between object and subject, etc., and the kind of discourses of difference that has emerged in today's cultural heritage debate, where some heritage researchers propose, for example, that there should be one form of heritage management in South America, another one in Southeast Asia, and yet another one in Europe, because according to some researchers and museum heritage managers, we need various kinds of management. But I don't believe in that. I want to use the examples here that I just told you to show that various heritage practices and managements are actually allowed to run parallel at the same time. And I want to urge you to examine these overlaps and the gaps. And in these overlaps and gaps, I hope that you can find some answers and at best also suggestions for future museum collection management and curation. And with that, I would like to stop and say thank you very much.
We're clapping you. Sí, le mostramos.
Ah, thank you.
we thought it was very pertinent to invite you, Ana. One second. Nos pareció pertinente invitar a la profesora Karlstom, profesora asociada, como ella prefiere, de la Universidad de Uppsala, debido a que lo que ella está trabajando, si bien es una cosa que circula muchísimo en nuestro medio, me pareció que era interesante traer el tema de los estudios críticos del patrimonio, Critical Heritage Studies, sobre la mesa, vincularlo tal vez con nuestro quehacer museológico y también vincular esto que ella habla de la nueva museología, de criticar los espacios, con justamente la razón que nos convoca, que es el aniversario de la Mesa de Santiago de Chile. I'm mentioning the Santiago de Chile table, Ana. Ella, por ejemplo, es miembro fundador, yo no lo recordé en la presentación, de la Asociación de Critical Heritage Studies Association, que va a hacer un congreso, por ejemplo, sobre el tema este año en Chile, que es una buena instancia para dialogar. Que I am going to mention, Ana, that en el congreso, las personas que hablen en lenguas indígenas tienen la opción de solicitar explicar su ponencia en esa lengua. I'm mentioning, for example, that indigenous languages are permitted and encouraged in your Congress, and they will have simultaneous translation. Me pareció importante traer todos estos elementos para intentar tener un diálogo y tratar de construir algo a futuro. Lo que quieran preguntar, sería un honor traducir. Espero no haberlos abrumado con esta breve. I will ask them if they have any question.
Yeah.
Preguntas, dudas, críticas, por favor, a mí, no al profe.
Please, how are you there?
Hello.
For you, why don't speak in Sweden, in your language? If you nos dices que en Chile lenguas indígenas van a ser aceptadas. What you speak in English? Yeah.
No se escucha bien, ¿saben?
Sí, ella quiere. Why she is not speaking Swedish? Why not? Now. Yes. Why? Because the original people today, every meeting speak in their own language. Yes. No. It's a part.
Shall I answer? Because I cannot hear what Leticia is saying, so I can just hear what the lady who's posing the question said. But can I answer or? Yeah. Yes, it's a very good question. And I actually, the day before yesterday, we had a long discussion with my students. I have a master students, and they are international. They come from the Netherlands, from China, from Korea, from all over the world. And we had this discussion about language and the neo-imperialism of English as world language, so to say. And when I am on academic conferences, for example, I am more or less forced to speak English because that's the common language that we have agreed upon. That is our common language. and today specifically, I would have been useless if I persisted to speak Swedish, because I doubt no one there in the room, or not even Leticia, who is translating kindly, knows Swedish. So, but I agree, and I have now quite a lot of experience recently from living and working and being employed locally at the Thai University in Bangkok, Thammasat University, where I was working for 2 years. And I had only Thai colleagues, and they are teaching only in Thai. But the reason why they invited me to work there was to help introducing international programs and international PhD programs. So I was supposed to speak English because the student groups were expanding to also include international students. But everything that is published that is of most interest to me in the heritage field by my colleagues locally in Bangkok is published in Thai, of course. So if I wouldn't have spoken Thai, I wouldn't have understood even half of all the interesting research results that Thai colleagues come up with. So, and I think it's similar in all other countries too. So what we can reach and learn from and get knowledge from, which is kind of equivalent for all people in the world, if we prefer to do it in English, is just a small amount of what the total amount of knowledge that people have in all parts of the world. But still, we have to agree upon something, because it's difficult to talk otherwise.
And why the drums, bronze drums? Why the bronze?
Why bronze drums? Well, I was living in Laos for quite many years when I did my PhD study, and my PhD project was concerned heritage preservation in general. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the project led to challenging what we have discussed now, the neo-colonial, post-colonial kind of Western exclusive kind of heritage discourse. But I also came across the bronze drum at the very late stage in my fieldwork, when I was working with my PhD project, because I didn't know they existed. But then I realized that they could help me to also do research to better understand how living heritage is a super important part of the heritage practice in that specific context, because we don't see cultural heritage in that sense as part of living cultural heritage here in Sweden, for example, not to the same extent as they do just naturally in the context where I was doing my research. So I thought that I wanted to continue to do postdoc project and continuous research, and then focus on the bronze drums to, through them, also understand how heritage is something that is not only stable, put in a museum, material focused, but rather part of a living heritage, where we have to accept that the actual heritage is changing and decaying and being destroyed, etc. And it is okay.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Pregunta breve que le quiera hacer a la profe, a la profesora Karlstom. Ahí. Come, Patricia, please. No, así te ve, porque también. We have one more question, Anna, if you don't mind.
Hi.
Hello.
La hago en español y vos la traducís. Bueno. Si conoces algún ejemplo donde esté sistematizado la inclusión de la comunidad en la ley, digamos, una ley de... No. Hi, I will do it in English now. If you have any example where the law includes the community in this third space, like you mentioned.
Yeah, there is actually law that I know of, because this thing about laws is also something that we need to study further, because I haven't done very much studies into actual laws and regulations and those kind of texts. But I know that in Burma, in Myanmar, they have laws that allow these kind of small museums, that, as we call them, that are not part of the official structure of national museums or so on, which is usually a small village temple or the houses of village chiefs or the like. And this law says that objects are allowed to be collected in these kind of alternative museums, which is a law that I haven't come across in any other countries. So in that sense, because when accepting that these objects are put in these small museums and managed in a local way where change and decay is kind of accepted, because if they are collected in the temple, the people there also allow other people to come and use the objects in a way that national museums, for example, don't do. Because if you have an object in a museum on a display, a group of people cannot come and borrow it and use it. You have to wear white gloves and you have to ask for permission to look at it, and etc. So by having this law letting people have their private collections in that unorganized way, but it's organized according to the small museum structure, I think this is something that is promising, and something also that we need to look more into and try to understand if there are, because I'm sure there are laws that are like this. But often these are also very separate from each other. The laws concerning tangible heritage is under one minister or department, government department, whereas laws concerning intangible cultural heritage and living heritage is put in another and under another department or ministry. So they are separate from the beginning, which also makes it a bit difficult, of course, to implement.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Genial de una, I will mention, but for another occasion maybe, the example of the Swedish museum where you had that amazing wooden structure that was supposed to rotten, remember that? But maybe in another moment we can.
Yeah.
Hay una historia alucinante en Suecia que ellos devolvieron una pieza de patrimonio al pueblo originario. El pueblo originario la colocó en el bosque, porque la idea, de acuerdo a la tradición y la cultura, era que esta pieza debía pudrirse en el bosque. Y la gente sueca que la había devuelto estaban como, fue muy, I am very pleased.
Yeah, it's a super interesting example, so I'm happy that you mention it.
Si quieren, I will say that si quieren, what was the country they gave back? I don't remember.
Canada.
Lo devolvieron a Canadá, a un grupo originario que su cultura hay una réplica en el Museo de Antropología en Estocolmo, pero claro, era lo que tenía que suceder, y fue, no, era una estructura de madera, un tronco, todo tallado de forma ceremonial, pero una vez que eso se termina de tallar, eso se devuelve al bosque y debe pudrirse en el bosque, y eso había sido tomado. Exacto, eso había sido tomado, estuvo muchos años ahí, albergado con humedad. I'm telling briefly and then I can, sorry, después, si quieren, después, con mucho gusto, yo les puedo pasar. I'm telling Anna that if they want, I can send them links if they want.
Yes, absolutely.
So they can read. Y eso se debía devolver. Pero en Suecia, cuando lo habían devuelto, pero lo devolvimos, lo dejaron pudrir. Nosotros lo teníamos con humedad controlada. No. Pero creo que eso, I'm sorry, I'm saying to them, and I will leave you, thank you for your time, that I think that is the main, like the core of this conversation, to understand that decay, for example, if it's part of the ritual and the meaning of the object, can be also heritage. Digamos, el deterioro o la destrucción, en algunos casos, también es patrimonio, y me parecía re interesante traer eso, más allá de que la profesora, como muy bien comentó la compañera, no habla inglés, yo no conocía a nadie en el medio local, tal vez es mi propio error, que me interesaba traer estos ejemplos y conversar. Ok, ¿alguna pregunta corta? Porque ya los atrasé todas las... ¿Alguien más quiere preguntar algo? Oh, okay. Anna, you have been amazing. Thank you so much. If you want, say hello to say goodbye, guys. Wait, I will.
Thank you very much for letting me in, and thank you so much, and good luck with the remaining day with the colloquium.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You can follow us, all the colloquium. We are on
Yeah.
YouTube, so you can follow up all of the colloquium and see all of the rest of the presentations today and tomorrow. If you want.
Thank you.
You are very
I
welcome.
will check that.
Hope to
I
see
have
you
the
soon.
link.
Thank you very much for coming and hope to
Thank
see you
you.
soon. Goodbye.
Bye bye, everybody.